Police in Central California find themselves in the midst of a violent crime wave. At first, the deaths appear unrelated. But detectives uncover evidence that points to a single killer. In Virginia, women start turning up dead in their own homes. And it appears a sadistic serial killer is to blame. But until police can identify a suspect, they remain powerless to stop him. When there is no obvious connection between victim and killer, solving a murder can be difficult. But forensic experts can play a vital role in exposing the predator who chooses random targets. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. California's central coastline is famous for its rugged beauty and isolation. But in the early 1980s, the city of Santa Cruz became the backdrop for a series of violent crimes. On April 23rd, rescue workers and police from the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office responded to a call about a vehicle found burning along a rural mountain road. The car had been burning for hours and was completely destroyed. To authorities, it appeared to be the work of vandals. But a closer inspection revealed a much more gruesome act than arson. A human body, burnt beyond recognition, lay in the front seat. The unidentified victim was removed from the burned-out wreckage and transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Investigators began searching for clues to explain the fire. But they found none of the telltale signs suggesting that an accident or engine trouble were to blame. A check on the tags revealed the car was registered to 20-year-old Mark Farrell, who listed an address less than a mile from the scene.
1 Frank John Mary.
Detective Sergeant David Deverell oversaw the investigation. The lack of an obvious cause of the fire was troubling.
There was no reason for the car to have caught fire. There was no dynamic crash. It's very unusual to have, a body burnt up in a vehicle with no explanation as to how it happens.
Police hoped the autopsy would yield more answers.
This is Farrell.
With Detective Deverell present, forensic pathologist Dr. Richard Mason began his examination by x-raying the victim. After reviewing the results, it was clear this death was no accident.
I could see evidence of at least 3, possibly 4 bullet pathways through the chest, entering on the right and exiting on the left. There was also a very probable gunshot wound to the head.
The young male victim had been murdered. But the heat of the fire had destroyed any ballistics evidence that may have been left behind. But then, embedded in the young man's chest, Dr. Mason found a single bullet that had somehow survived the intense heat. Dr. Mason, a gun enthusiast, analyzed the fragment under a microscope. It was a unique bullet.
I'm a longtime handgun rifle shooter, and I recognized it immediately as a .38 special wad cutter. They are heavy, they're very penetrative, and they will drill deeply into a body.
Dental records later confirmed that the murder victim was in fact the owner of the burned-out car, 20-year-old Mark Farrell. Now, police had to find out who had killed him and why. Investigators questioned the young man's mother. She couldn't imagine why anyone would have wanted to harm her son. She said she last saw him the previous afternoon.
Let's do that.
Mark, a college student studying to be an engineer, was late for the night shift where he worked as an analyst at a nearby electronics plant. There didn't seem to be anything that was troubling him. Mark was well liked by everyone who knew him. He didn't have any enemies. With no obvious suspects, police looked to reconstruct the last hours of Mark Farrell's life. His employer confirmed that Mark had worked his entire shift the night before and left around 2 a.m. There were no indications that anything out of the ordinary had happened during his shift. And he said Mark got along well with all of his co-workers. The manager handed over the videotape from the company's security camera. At the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office, Detective Deverell reviewed the tapes.
It's the surveillance.
He watched as Mark Farrell left work without incident.
In looking at the tape, there was certainly nothing unusual in it. Looked like, it was the end of the night. He was headed home. There was absolutely nothing in it.
Weeks passed with no additional leads. Soon, the investigation turned cold. And the caseload for Santa Cruz homicide detectives was about to increase. 2 months after the murder of Mark Farrell, the tranquility of the nearby community of Laguna Beach was shattered. The lifeless bodies of 2 men were discovered on the beach. Officers and crime scene technicians were dispatched to the scene.
Right about here.
Right.
They saw him.
There, they found 2 young Asian men who had both been shot in the back multiple times. Police began processing the scene for clues. In the breast pocket of one of the victims, they found a wallet.
All right.
See anything else? Or?
No, that's good. I got the shot. We can put him back down and then
Okay.
we'll check the wallet for ID.
Okay.
And inside was identification belonging to a man named Check Chin, a resident of San Francisco.
You've got some.
Police could find no ID on the second victim.
Craig, is it okay if I come in from this angle here?
Here and then we'll check him for
Right.
ID.
His wallet was missing.
It looks like he's got a set of keys.
However, they located a set of car keys. Detectives theorized the double murder was the result of a robbery gone bad. Using the set of keys, police were able to locate the victim's car.
Let's get the distance between 2 and 7.
Based on the vehicle registration, they believed that the second victim was the car's owner, 30-year-old Han Lee, also from San Francisco.
Looks pretty good. So we'll get Dave in here and let him know what we're going to
How's it looking there?
As police began looking for clues to the killer's identity, they noticed one empty spot in the nearby parking lot. And in the space were fresh tire tracks.
Somewhere this guy may have driven, so.
Yeah, so we'll catch this guy and
Unsure if the killer had left the marks, crime scene technicians collected the evidence using a plaster cast mold.
sticky.
The nature of the double murder troubled police.
It was a really unusual scene for us. We had two bodies up here on the trail. Multiple homicide is certainly something we don't see. It's something that concerned us greatly.
The victims' bodies were transported to the coroner's office for autopsy. Again, Dr. Richard Mason worked the case.
Sure. This, when you're done with the overviews, while he's in a position, we'll get the ID shot.
He extracted the fatal bullets from the victims' backs. He had seen them before. They were unique .38 caliber wad cutters, identical to the bullet recovered from the body of Mark Farrell 2 months earlier. Police now had 3 unsolved murders on their hands, and it appeared the same gun had been used in all of the homicides. Dr. Mason and Detective Deverell realized it was too much of a coincidence to be ignored.
It's an unusual gun.
Police in Santa Cruz, California had 3 unsolved homicides on their hands. And the bullets recovered from all of the victims appeared to have originated from the same gun. To find out, the bullets were forwarded to ballistics expert Paul Doherty at the San Mateo Police Crime Lab. From the size and diameter, he confirmed that all were .38 caliber wad cutter bullets. Typically, wad cutters are used for target shooting.
A wad cutter is a projectile that's designed to punch a hole in paper for target shooting. So you get a nice clean hole so you can measure your accuracy of your score. In other words, in some cases when you get right on the line, you want to make sure you're cut. If you've cut the line, the score goes higher, and that's what this does. It just cuts a nice clean hole.
Each gun leaves unique markings on a bullet as it travels through the barrel. When examiners compared the bullet recovered from 20-year-old Mark Farrell to the ones taken from the 2 Asian victims found at Laguna Beach, they found that all shared the same characteristics. And after extensive research, authorities determined that the markings left on the bullets had likely been produced by a rare Great Western single-action revolver.
Manufacturer and see if we can't get somewhere with that. Although it becomes a little problematic when you start looking.
It was a promising lead, but it was nearly impossible for police to track down everyone who currently owned the handgun.
I don't think it's a standard manufacturer.
And though it seemed unlikely, Detective Dave Deverell had to consider that the 3 murders were unconnected.
You look at it and go, well, maybe the gun got passed from one person to another, and there really is no connection between the cases. That didn't work for any of us. It just was not, didn't make sense that a gun and bullets would somehow transfer from one person to another and be used again in another homicide.
To find out if there was a connection, detectives traveled to San Francisco's Chinatown district, where the 2 Laguna Beach victims, Han Lee and Chek Chin, had lived. It's a notoriously insulated community, and investigators realized that getting information would not be easy. A team from the Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office worked the case. Homicide Detective Joe Hennard uncovered a possible lead.
We had information that both victims had worked at the Golden Dragon restaurant in Chinatown, where 2 years prior there was a gangland shooting where a number of people were murdered. We were concerned that there could have been gang activity, that these guys were followed down to Santa Cruz and were shot and killed on the way over to the beach. And an interpreter, Mr. Liu. Thank you.
Through an interpreter from the San Francisco Police Department's Asian Gang Task Force, The manager of the restaurant described the two young men as decent, hard-working employees. In fact, he last saw them the day before they were found murdered. It was payday, and the men were anxious to receive their checks. They had made plans to take a day trip down to Laguna Beach. The manager didn't believe the two men were involved in any gang activity. He could think of no one who would have wanted to harm them. Having found no connection between the victims, detectives realized they were powerless to prevent more killings.
We got a photo of our...
Soon, the investigation into the murders of Mark Farrell, Chek Chin, and Han Lee had hit a dead end.
Just need to do a little more work up on it. The case was very frustrating. We had the bullets linking the murders. We knew what type of gun we were looking for. We had a lot of evidence in the case, but we didn't have even a glimmer of why these three people were killed.
But a year and a half later, all of that changed. A man named Dave Bonin contacted police. His daughter, Lynn, he said, was in great danger. She had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Mark Cunningham, and now he was stalking her. The daughter feared for her life. Mark Cunningham had allegedly bragged about killing 3 men a year and a half earlier.
Okay, thanks.
It was the break police had been waiting for. The father took them to speak with Lynn at the grocery store where she worked. His daughter was afraid to speak to police about Cunningham, so he offered to bring her out of the store. But there was just one complication. Mark Cunningham was there, talking to Lynn. Dave Bonin got his daughter's attention and brought her outside. When Detective Dave Deverell heard the suspect was inside, he quickly interviewed Lynn.
And kind of did just the quickest interview on record. You know, we kind of went, Lynn, your dad tells us that your boyfriend may have killed some people, and we need to know what happened.
Lynn told police that a year and a half earlier, she and Mark Cunningham were driving around near Laguna Beach. Suddenly, Mark pulled into a parking spot, claiming he needed cash. He said he'd be right back, but he wouldn't tell her where he was going. Lynn told police he was gone for several minutes. She recalled that when he returned, he was agitated and out of breath. She thought she saw a gun in his possession. Police realized it was the same spot where the 2 Asian men were found murdered.
It became apparent to us in this real brief interview with Lynn, Mark was the guy we were looking for.
As Lynn finished telling her story, Mark Cunningham exited the store. In a wide-open parking lot, there was any number of ways the suspect could escape. And if Mark Cunningham was in fact the killer, police feared he would not hesitate to use violence. After a year and a half, police in Santa Cruz, California finally had a solid lead in 3 unsolved homicides.
Why don't you guys come on over here?
Mark Cunningham had allegedly bragged to his ex-girlfriend that he was responsible for the shooting deaths. Cunningham was cooperative and taken into custody without incident.
All right, what is this for? I'll tell you, it's a good start.
Under
Mark,
questioning, he insisted he knew nothing about any of the murders.
I'm sorry, I really...
He claimed that his girlfriend, Lynn Bonin, was trying to get back at him for ending the relationship. He denied owning a Great Western single-action revolver, the type of weapon used in the 3 killings. Police didn't believe him, but they had no hard evidence to prove he was lying. Still, Cunningham remained in police custody. When a few days passed with no additional leads, police turned to his ex-girlfriend for more information. Lynn Bonin had reason to believe that Cunningham had committed the murders.
We just threw it over.
She said that a few days after the 2 men were found murdered at Laguna Beach, Cunningham admitted to the crimes.
What are you going to do about it? Come here.
Then, without warning, he pulled out an old revolver and forced Lynn to the ground. He threatened to kill her and her father if she ever said anything to police. A short while later, Cunningham got rid of the revolver.
He just told me to sit there and wait.
Lynn didn't know anything about Mark Farrell, the 20-year-old man who had been shot and burned in his car along a mountain road.
Mark, at some point, did Mark leave?
I don't know.
However, in the past, she and Cunningham and some friends would hang out on that road and have bonfires. Cunningham would often brandish his weapon at passers-by who complained about the illegal fires. Police had strong circumstantial evidence linking Mark Cunningham to the scenes where all 3 victims had been found murdered.
There's a lot they're doing.
Now they needed hard evidence.
No,
They turned to the tire tread marks found at Laguna Beach nearly 2 years earlier. The tires from the truck that had been driven at the time of the murders had been sold, but police were able to track down the current owners. The tires were collected and forwarded to the crime lab for analysis. First, examiners generated an inked impression of Cunningham's tire treads. Then, transparent overlays were placed on top of life-size photographs of the tire tread found at Laguna Beach nearly 2 years earlier. They found that all of the class characteristics, including the shape, size, and dimensions of the tread design, lined up perfectly. The evidence had placed Mark Cunningham's vehicle at the scene of the double murder. But to tie him to all 3 homicides, they needed to find the murder weapon. Lynn Bonin agreed to help. She brought investigators to the area where she believed the gun had been tossed. It appeared to be a waste of time. But then, buried under dirt and debris, they found a pistol. It was a rare Great Western single-action revolver. To prove it was the murder weapon, police forwarded the evidence to forensic examiners. Ballistics expert Paul Doherty knew it would not be easy. Rust had severely damaged the weapon. But after days of cleaning the revolver, he was able to get the gun to fire.
3, 2, 1, fire. Firing.
Ballistics tests proved that the gun was used in both the Laguna Beach murders and the death of 20-year-old Mark Farrell. Cunningham was subsequently charged with 3 counts of murder. Police theorized that Cunningham had started a small bonfire by the side of the road. Mark Farrell, headed home after a long night of work, saw the flames and stopped to find out what was going on. Without warning, Cunningham pulled his gun and shot the young man several times. In an effort to cover his tracks, Cunningham then doused the car with a flammable substance, then set the vehicle on fire. It was a crime of opportunity, one the killer would repeat several weeks later at Laguna Beach. Mark Cunningham was tried and convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Mark Cunningham preyed on victims who happened to cross his path. But in Richmond, Virginia, one killer carefully looked for targets that shared something in common. On the morning of September 19th, 1987, a man noticed a car with its engine running pulled up onto the sidewalk. It appeared the vehicle had been abandoned. The man called police. 911 dispatchers ran a check on the tags and learned the car was registered to a woman who lived a few blocks away from where the vehicle was found. But when efforts to contact her failed, police tracked down her landlord. An officer was dispatched to the residence. The landlord was also concerned. She had noticed a missing window screen and feared the place had been burglarized. Not knowing what to expect, the officer cautiously made his way through the apartment. In the bedroom, he made a gruesome discovery. A woman lay dead.
Dispatch, come back.
She had been tied up and strangled. Within minutes, Richmond police and crime scene technicians were dispatched to the scene. The woman, found fully clothed, was identified as 35-year-old Donna Doyle.
Still there, yeah.
No items appeared to be missing. Robbery was not the motive behind the murder. Believing the killer had gained access to the residence through the window, technicians scoured the area for prints. But they found nothing. And the victim's car, which had likely been taken by the killer and then abandoned, yielded no additional clues. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the death had resulted from ligature strangulation. The device had been fashioned from a sock, shoestring, and vacuum cleaner pipe. Donna Doyle had been slowly strangled. Though the victim was clothed in cut-off jeans and a shirt, there were indications she had been sexually assaulted. Biological evidence of rape and some stray hairs were collected. At the time, DNA testing was in its infancy, and all serologists could determine was that the killer had type O blood. Homicide Detective Ray Williams was assigned the case. He realized this investigation would not be simple.
I worked homicide for 20-some odd years in the city, and after looking and reviewing the scene, I knew it to be a very unusual homicide. The way she was tied and strangled was very apparent to me that at that point we weren't dealing with an ordinary killer.
Hoping for more detailed information, the hairs recovered from Donna Doyle's body were forwarded to forensic experts at the Virginia Division of Forensic Science. They determined that 2 of the hairs had not originated from the victim. And from their texture and cross-sectional shape, examiners concluded they had come from an African-American male. For investigators, it wasn't much to go on. To learn more, detectives questioned the employer of a local bookstore where Donna Doyle worked. On the day of the murder, Donna had worked her regular shift. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened that day. She described Donna as a dedicated employee and a very likable person, although she was somewhat shy. After closing the store, Donna headed home. Her employer didn't know if she had plans that night. She believed that Donna lived alone and was unaware if she currently had a boyfriend. After 2 weeks, detectives had no luck identifying a suspect or an obvious motive. The investigation into Donna Doyle's murder was going nowhere. Then, emergency dispatchers received a 911 call. There had been another homicide. As police in Richmond, Virginia struggled to solve the brutal rape and murder of 35-year-old Donna Doyle, they received word of another homicide. The victim, identified as 32-year-old Dr. Stephanie Harris, was discovered inside the bedroom closet by her husband.
Okay.
The scene was less than 2 miles from the site of Donna Doyle's murder. Her hands and feet were bound, and a cloth belt was wrapped tightly around her neck. She had been sexually assaulted. For police, the crime scene looked eerily familiar. There were no indications of robbery, and it appeared the killer had entered through a window. But few clues to his identity were found. The victim's husband explained that he discovered his wife around 2 a.m. upon returning from Maryland, where he was a law student. He had no idea who could have done this. He was later cleared as a suspect. Police sensed the 2 murders were connected. To find out, Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro began examining Dr. Stephanie Harris. She found broken blood vessels in the victim's eyes, called petechial hemorrhages. Like the Donna Doyle case, that suggested Stephanie Harrison had been strangled slowly.
When the victims were examined, there were certain patterns of injuries that were common, and those patterns included evidence of restraint, evidence of strangulation, evidence of injury that took place over a period of time, which was very disturbing because it would indicate a pattern of torture.
The similarities between the crimes led authorities to believe that the same sadistic killer had committed both murders.
When you do autopsies, you get some insight into the nature of the person who committed the crimes. It was apparent from the injuries, from the restraints, and from their physical findings that these were very cruel deaths and that they were committed by somebody who enjoyed doing it.
The biological evidence recovered from Stephanie Harrison was sent to forensic serologists. An analysis revealed that those samples and the ones collected from Donna Doyle shared the same blood type. Both were type O.
Okay, folks, let's fall in. Conduct
Richmond police were certain that the same killer, dubbed by the press as the South Side Strangler, had committed both murders.
We've got the evening watch. Our target is
And having found no obvious connection between the two victims, it appeared he chose his victims randomly. They feared he would strike again. The question now was where and when. They got their answer 2 months later. On November 22nd, 1987, police just a few miles outside of Richmond in Chesterfield County were dispatched to the scene of a murder. The victim, 15-year-old Dawn Chang, had been viciously raped and strangled in her bedroom. Like the other cases, the perpetrator had entered the bedroom through the window.
Here's what we got, the 8.
Strangely, investigators found a figure 8 painted on the victim's body. But aside from a few stray hairs, little physical evidence was recovered. However, the hairs were enough for authorities to conclude that Dawn Chang had been the South Side Strangler's third victim. Unlike the other victims, Dawn was a teenager. She was Asian, and she didn't live alone. In fact, her parents were sleeping in the next room at the time of the murder.
How old was she?
They never heard a thing.
15.
They described their daughter as a typical teenager.
It's a recent picture.
Great, time for me to get back to work.
You have a lot of work to do?
Yes.
They last saw her the night before.
Go. Go steady.
After dinner, Dawn said she had some homework to do and planned on going to bed after she finished. She said goodnight and went to her bedroom. The mother discovered her daughter's lifeless body the following morning. Authorities had a serial killer on the loose, and he appeared to be spreading out beyond the Richmond city limits. His ability to avoid detection led police to believe he had done this before. Desperate to generate a lead, Detective Ray Williams contacted police departments throughout the region, looking for any unsolved cases with a similar MO. Less than 100 miles away, in the Washington, D.C. suburb of Arlington, Virginia, he got a hit. There, Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington County Police Department had several unsolved rapes and murders that went back nearly 3 years. The details of those were frighteningly similar to the murders in Richmond and Chesterfield County. 3 weeks after 15-year-old Dawn Chang's homicide, Arlington County Police had been dispatched to the home of Sandra Thomas.
Watch where we're stepping.
The 34-year-old woman had been discovered raped and murdered in her home. She lived alone, and like the victims in Richmond, she had been strangled with household items. From hairs and biological evidence recovered from the scene, police determined that Sandra Thomas's killer was an African-American male with type O blood. The other unsolved crimes in Arlington with a similar MO had been committed in 1984. At first, it seemed odd to Detective Horgus that the killer would suddenly stop. only to resume 3 years later.
He didn't stop because he's got a girlfriend. He didn't stop because he got married. He stopped because he either relocated, he's dead, and he's not dead if he's doing the other ones, or he's in prison.
Detective Horgus reviewed recent parole and probation records, looking for African-American males who were arrested in Arlington in 1984. Then he found something. In early 1984, a 21-year-old man named Timothy W. Spencer was arrested in connection with a series of breaking and entering and petty thefts. Though those were non-violent crimes, records also indicated he was identified as the prime suspect in a series of unsolved rapes throughout Arlington. However, he was never charged with those crimes. After serving 3 years on the theft charges, Spencer was paroled. And that wasn't all.
His probation officer here in Arlington knew that he was released from prison to a halfway house down in Richmond. And he was released about 2 weeks before the first murder.
If Detective Horgus was right, Timothy Spencer was now the prime suspect in at least 4 murders throughout Virginia. But unless investigators could physically link him to the crimes, he would remain free to kill again. Police in Arlington, Virginia have finally identified a suspect in a series of unsolved rapes and murders that spanned a 3-year period. And those homicides bore an eerie resemblance to a string of serial murders taking place 100 miles away in Richmond.
All right, here's Tucker's hams.
To find out if they were dealing with the same predator, Arlington County Homicide Detective Joe Horgus traveled to Richmond. There, he teamed up with Detective Ray Williams. After comparing the details of all the homicides, there could be little doubt that the same killer had committed all of the crimes. The detectives learned that their prime suspect, Timothy Spencer, had been recently paroled and was currently living in a halfway house in Richmond. According to the director of the house, the suspect was currently out running errands. Detectives asked to see the logbook that contained the times and dates of when a parolee leaves and returns to the house. According to the records, Timothy Spencer had signed himself out on September 18th, October 2nd, and November 21st. Dates that corresponded to the murders in Richmond and Chesterfield County. He had also signed out on November 25th to spend Thanksgiving weekend with his mother in Arlington. Arlington County Detective Joe Horgus realized that Timothy Spencer's mother lived just a few blocks from where the latest victim, Sandra Thomas, had been murdered that same weekend.
What are the odds that 100 miles away, our lady up here that's murdered, MO fits identical to theirs down there, and where's Timothy Spencer? He's up here at the same time. Too many coincidences just don't add up. What it adds up to is logic. This is our man.
A short while later, Timothy Spencer returned home. And police were there waiting. The suspected serial killer was taken into custody on suspicion of murder. A search of his room at the halfway house failed to produce any hard evidence linking him to the murders. But on his bed, they discovered a drawing of a figure 8, similar to the one found painted on the body of 15-year-old Dawn Chang.
All right, I'm gonna show you a couple
Under
pictures
questioning,
here. This will
Spencer admitted nothing.
jog your memory a little bit. So see if you recognize these folks, okay? Do you know that person? No.
He claimed to have no knowledge about any rapes or murders.
Have you ever been to
And he denied drawing the figure 8 found on his bed.
Yeah.
Detectives sensed he was lying,
early on that night?
and now they looked to the forensic evidence for proof. Hair and blood samples were collected from the suspect. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science, criminalists compared the hairs taken from Spencer to those recovered from several of the crime scenes. The shape, size, color, and texture of the hairs were identical. Though Timothy Spencer had type O blood, so did millions of other people. For irrefutable proof that he was the South Side Strangler, examiners turned to a newly developed, more sophisticated type of analysis called DNA testing. The testing revealed that the genetic profile of the suspect was identical to the ones generated from the biological evidence left behind at 4 murder scenes. The chances that the killer was someone other than Timothy Spencer were nearly 900 million to 1. He was charged with 4 counts of murder. Investigators theorize that after randomly choosing his prey, Spencer, an experienced burglar, would slip silently through his victims' windows. Once inside, he raped and strangled them. Timothy Spencer was sentenced to death for the murders of Donna Doyle, Dr. Stephanie Harrison, and Dawn Chang in Richmond, and for the death of Sandra Thomas in Arlington. He was the first person in the United States to be executed on the basis of DNA fingerprinting. For Richmond homicide detective Ray Williams, the new forensic technology could not have come along at a better time.
Were it not for DNA evidence, Timothy Spencer would have never been convicted. See, when you put a case before a jury, the jury has to see, touch, feel, and hear. We didn't have a whole lot of things for them to see, touch, feel, and hear, other than DNA. And that DNA spoke for itself.
Some killers require no motive at all to commit their crimes. And for homicide detectives, identifying a suspect can be a challenge. In those cases, they must rely on the physical evidence to expose a killer who has set his sights on random targets. In suburban New York, a young mother is brutally murdered in her kitchen. Police race to identify her killer, but fragmentary clues left at the scene are all that remain. In Idaho, an elderly couple is found shot to death in their home. Eyewitness accounts vary. Police scoured for clues and look to forensic science to identify a suspect. When killers are bent on revenge, nothing will stop them. But forensic examiners can find the hidden messages in the clues they leave behind and bring justice to those killed at close range. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The suburbs of New York City are more accustomed to a peaceful way of life, generally untouched by violent crime. In January of 1997, that would change.
Manor Police 911 emergency. Can I help you?
Please, no.
Okay, all right, sir. All right. 1625 Pelham Drive.
Pelham Manor and Westchester County Police received an urgent 911 call.
Manor units, 1625 Pelham Drive.
Jim Martin reported that he found his wife Kathleen in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Police arrived and combed the scene. They learned that the 32-year-old woman had been shot in the face and stabbed. Because there were two weapons used during the homicide, Lieutenant Christopher Calabrese of the Westchester County Police Department speculated that there were two perpetrators.
Inspection of the body revealed that there was wounds to the abdomen, the hands, he had defensive cut wounds, and also a gunshot to the head. So we were looking for two suspects from the very beginning. Normally you're not going to have two different types of wounds on the same victim with one perp.
Anybody that might have made a offhanded comment?
Investigators interviewed Jim Martin. He was well known in the county. He and Kathleen owned a horse stable nearby. Jim told police the last time he saw his wife was earlier that day. The two had met for lunch around 1:30 in the afternoon. He went back to the stable, and she took care of some errands.
Anything at all, and every little detail.
Jim was cooperative and agreed to go to the police department later for questioning. The body was sent to the medical examiner for autopsy. Police discovered bloody footprints on the kitchen floor.
You've got a bloody footprint here.
They photographed and lifted the prints, hoping that once suspects were identified, they could match them to their shoes. To forensic examiners, the impression resembled a cowboy boot. On the outside of a pantry door, investigators found a bullet hole. It had been partially hidden by a Christmas card.
Lieutenant?
The bullet went through the cabinet door and landed on the shelf inside. The area was photographed and the bullet collected for further analysis. There was no sign of forced entry, and the burglar alarm had not been triggered. Lieutenant Al Mazziello of the Pelham Manor Police Department was disturbed by the violence of the crime.
Well, I was very surprised because Pelham Manor is the kind of place that we don't normally have a homicide. I was very concerned about the family.
At the police station, Lieutenant Calabrese started by narrowing down the suspects. Jim Martin was first on his list.
Jim was obviously the closest relationship to Kathleen Martin, who's her husband. He was the one who discovered the body. And in many cases, when there's a wife that is killed, we need to eliminate the husband as a suspect.
Martin consented to taking a voice stress exam.
Is your name Jim Martin?
The test is similar to a lie detector. It was not admissible in court. Police use it as a tool to eliminate potential suspects. Lieutenant Robert Giordano administered the exam.
Is that wall white? The science behind this particular instrument is that it measures a difference in your vocal response. There's a pattern that is printed that is in all our vocal cords, and as stress increases, there's a change in that pattern. So, did you murder Kathleen?
No.
Through a series of yes or no questions, Giordano determined that it was unlikely Jim Martin was involved in the homicide. He was cooperative and relayed information that might be helpful to the investigation. Kathleen's body arrived at the Westchester County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Lewis Rowe performed the autopsy. He x-rayed the body. He determined that a bullet entered the left eye, went through the skull, and exited the back of the victim's head. The bullet then went through the cabinet door and landed on the shelf. Gunpowder residue stippled her skin. Kathleen's killer wasn't more than a foot away when he pulled the trigger. As Rowe examined the body, he found a stab wound to the abdomen and what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands. From the size and shape of the gash, it appeared that it had come from a curved-shaped knife. He found a 9mm shell casing tangled in her sweater. It was another indication of just how close the shooter stood to his victim. The victim's clothing was sent to forensic expert Ted Schwartz. Since Kathleen's killer stood so close to her when she was murdered, he examined the sweater looking for any fibers or hairs that were transferred from killers to victim during the crime. The sweater was made of acrylic material.
The sweater, I realized pretty early on, was very sheddable. So I knew that if I was going to eventually look at suspect items, that the sweater fibers would be a good starting point of something to look for.
In order to recognize the fibers on a suspect's clothing, Schwartz needed to clearly identify them. He and his team used an alternate light source to separate the wavelengths of the colors in the sweater. They each wore different colored goggles, red, orange, and yellow. When the color of light matched the color in the sweater, the fibers would fluoresce, and only one of the examiners would see them.
635, nothing for me. 670.
Fibers from the victim's sweater appeared fluorescent when viewed through the orange goggles.
So, yeah.
And I knew it was going to make the analysis a lot easier for me because of the fluorescence and the fact that I would be able to spot these type of fibers quite easily on things that I would eventually look at.
Investigators hoped that somewhere in Westchester County, invisible fibers were clinging to the killers. But who they were and how the police would find them was still a mystery. Detectives went to the stables that the Martins owned and operated. A worker told them that Kathleen was a popular riding instructor.
About 2 weeks ago,
But there were signs that someone may have wanted to harm her.
the horse trailer caught on fire out there. And weirdest thing was it had graffiti written.
A few months before the murder, a horse trailer was vandalized and set on fire. Kathleen's name was spray painted in graffiti on the side. The staff believed the vandalism was the act of an ex-employee named Carlos Cajigas,
Have a great day.
Thank you.
but there was no evidence linking him to the crime, and no charges were filed against him. Carlos Cajigas was brought in for questioning. Cajigas appeared cooperative. Kathleen, he said, was like a mother to him.
You need to know. I told you.
He would never harm her.
Test results are showing me that
Besides, he had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was at a friend's house cleaning carpets.
Can't call him. There's no phone.
He described in great detail how they cleaned the rugs and then hung them out to dry.
The one thing that struck me initially was he was extremely cooperative, to the point where his cooperation became a question for us. And initially, when you talk to somebody or interview somebody, people fall into two categories: people who are going to relay information to you, and people that are trying to convince you of information. And he fell into the category of trying to convince me.
is today Tuesday. Yes.
He agreed to take a voice stress exam, as Jim Martin had days earlier.
No.
Again, Lieutenant Giordano administered the test.
Do you know who murdered Kathleen?
No.
Giordano wasn't impressed.
I gave him the exam, and right off the bat, I knew he had failed.
The test was not admissible as evidence in court. Investigators believed they had a suspect, but they still had to connect him to the crime. Authorities in suburban New York had identified one of two suspects in the murder of Kathleen Martin. His name was Carlos Cajigas. He was recently fired from the horse stable Kathleen and her husband owned. He failed a voice stress test, but it was not admissible in court. Police had no real evidence. They needed more. Before they released him, he consented to a search of his car. Police collected several articles of clothing and vacuumed the interior for any loose hairs or fibers. Investigators questioned the friends and alibi of Cajigas.
The reason why we stopped by this evening, we want to talk to you about Carlos a little bit. He's a friend of yours.
The couple said he spent the afternoon with them cleaning rugs and did not leave until evening.
Well, as of late, she's been bugging me with spring cleaning, so we figured we
Investigators reminded the two that they were still looking for another suspect in the homicide.
took care of.
So it's just the three of you doing carpet cleaning here.
Yeah, and he was here.
But the couple stuck by their story.
Appreciate your cooperation.
If we need to talk to you again, we'll be in touch.
Okay, sure. Feel free.
Sure.
Lieutenant Calabrese was suspicious.
Their version of what he had done, or what they had done in cleaning this rug, was completely different from what his version was.
Lieutenant Calabrese was certain he had identified one of the suspects. But there was no evidence against him.
He'll be explaining to you.
They ran a background check on Cajigas and found that he had a rap sheet for grand larceny and possession of stolen property.
$500, we're going to do execute a search warrant for Richard's farm.
And he had a frequent accomplice, a man named Michael Fernandez.
10 minutes. Okay.
Authorities did not have much to go on, but picked up Michael Fernandez for questioning.
We'll be out of here soon. We just want to ask you
goes downstairs right now. He's told me to go.
They told him they had Cahigas in custody and knew he was involved. The ex-con cracked.
Don't take the whole rap.
Fernandez admitted that he and Cahigas had been planning to rob the Martins for weeks. He said he waited in the car while Cahigas went in the house. When Cahigas returned, he told him he shot and stabbed Kathleen because she went for the alarm. Cahigas handed him a 9mm gun and a knife to get rid of. Police didn't think Fernandez was telling the whole truth. It was rare that one person would use both a gun and a knife.
Is that what the gun is?
He had the gun. He gave it to him.
Still, he cooperated and took them to where he hid the gun and the knife. Police retrieved a curved knife. It was consistent with the weapon used to stab Kathleen. There were no identifiable prints or blood on it. Mike Fernandez was arrested. He was charged with criminal facilitation of a murder. Police also recovered the gun from the home of one of his friends. The ballistics examiner found no prints or blood residue on the weapon. The handgun was fired into a water tank, and a bullet was collected to compare with the bullet found in the pantry at the Martins' house. There were enough lands and grooves created on the bullet as it traveled through the gun barrel to make a consistent match. With the ballistic evidence and Fernandez's testimony, police had enough to arrest Carlos Cahigas. He denied any involvement in the crime. Police had the murder weapon, but there were no fingerprints tying it to Cahigas, and their key witness had a shady past. Police needed to crack Cahigas' alibi. Lieutenant Calabrese paid another call on the friends who said he was with them on the day of the murder. He pressed the woman for more details, reminding her that she could be held as an accessory to the crime if she lied to police.
You know that he's involved in this murder? You don't want to get involved in a murder investigation. That's not good for you, it's not good for your family. You did come to the truth.
She retracted her story. Carlos, she said, was at her house on the day of the murder. But then he got a page and left to pick up a guy named Mikey.
All right, later.
That was around 2:40 p.m. She said he returned a few hours later, carrying a backpack.
You have it here now?
A few days later, she overheard Cahigas telling her boyfriend that he shot some woman. She still had the backpack and turned it over to police. DNA expert Mary Eustace examined a pair of gloves found among the items in the backpack. She discovered several dark stains that looked like blood. They tested positive for human blood. The sample was sent for DNA testing. But the results would take time. Police hoped that Ted Schwartz could shed some light on the evidence. All of the items, including the gloves and the vacuum sweepings from Cahigas's car, were sent to him for analysis. If the gloves had been in contact with Kathleen's sweater, fibers from the sweater likely transferred onto the gloves. Strands from the gloves were exposed to the alternate light source. He knew the specific wavelength of fluorescent light that would make the fibers of Kathleen's sweater glow. They lit up like a neon sign. Amid the vacuum sweepings from Cahigas's car, there too the debris glowed with the telltale fibers. 41 fibers found on the suspect's items were consistent with the victim's sweater. And that wasn't all. A double transfer had occurred. Fibers from Cahigas's gloves were found on Kathleen's clothing. The evidence proved that Cahigas had committed the murder. But investigators believed that Michael Fernandez was also involved in the crime. And they still had no proof. Police had arrested 2 men for the murder of Kathleen Martin. Carlos Cahigas denied all involvement in the crime. Michael Fernandez only admitted to waiting in the getaway car. When the local news reported that 2 men were arrested for the slaying, witnesses came forward. A neighbor of the Martins recalled seeing Carlos Cahigas running away from the house on the day of the murder. Her son saw Michael Fernandez.
We had 2 different subjects exiting the Martin residence. And in fact, later on, when Mike Fernandez's picture was on the news, and our witness identified him or said to his parents that that's the person I saw exiting the Martin residence.
Michael Fernandez was inside the house. Based on the evidence, police believe that Cahigas, bent on revenge, went to the Martin house to rob and kill Kathleen. Cahigas was the trigger man. His accomplice, Michael Fernandez, stabbed her.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that when he went to the Martin house, that his intention was to kill Kathleen Martin. And Kathleen Martin knew him. He went there without any type of a mask or disguise. And she could identify him, obviously, so his intention was to leave no witnesses.
On February 3rd, 1999, Michael Fernandez pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In November 1998, Carlos Cahigas was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. In New York, carefully collected forensic evidence helped bring swift justice and put 2 killers behind bars. Unfortunately, sometimes analysis and interpretation of the evidence is more difficult, and a killer may go free for years. Bonneville County is located in eastern Idaho in the upper Snake River Valley. There, residents enjoy clean air and wide open space. In early March 1992, Leo Downard, a retired plant worker, and his wife Mary went about their daily lives. The Downard children had married and left home, but they still lived close enough to drop by. Leo and Mary loved nothing more than spending time with their grandchildren. It was a time in their lives when they learned to appreciate every day. On March 24th, neighbors of Leo and Mary were concerned when they found several days' worth of newspapers on the couple's lawn and the front door slightly ajar. Inside, they learned the gruesome truth. Leo Downard lay motionless on the living room floor. The neighbor also noticed some blood. He called 911.
Public safety, Melissa.
Investigators from the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. Sergeant Kim Marshall and Detective Victor Rodriguez were among the officers. Leo Downard was dead on the floor in the living room. He was in his pajamas. It appeared he had suffered multiple gunshot wounds to his head and chest.
Just in case he's over there.
Police scoured the room for clues. A trail of blood spatter extended around the body. 3 shell casings were scattered across the floor. The casings were photographed and collected. Upstairs, Mary Downard's lifeless body lay on the bed. It appeared she too had been shot multiple times. There were no signs of forced entry. The intruder had not left any fingerprints. Sergeant Marshall had a theory.
When we arrived at the residence, we found Mr. Downard was downstairs. He was next to a couch. Up the stairs and in the master bedroom, we located Mrs. Downard. The conclusion I had at the time was they'd opened the door to somebody they knew because they were shot during the night. It was obvious they were in bed, and they had a routine that they went through, locking the residence up when they went to bed, and somebody had to get them to open the door for them.
Detective Victor Rodriguez looked for any clues.
I turned the flashlight on and put it on the ground, and I showed the beam of light across the floor.
Next to the door, he found a tennis shoe print in the dust.
We didn't know whose it was. We thought maybe it might have been one of the paramedics. So immediately before the paramedics left, we looked at their shoes and found it's not the same shoe print. That was our suspect.
You need to take a picture of that.
The prints were photographed for a more detailed examination.
Here's one.
Rodriguez collected 3 shell casings from the bed.
Another casing. Like the same caliber.
Outside, investigators found an almost perfect print in the mud. It appeared to be the same type of print found in the bedroom. They made a plaster cast of the impression. Once they had a suspect in custody, they hoped to match his shoes to the scene. The medical examiner performed the autopsies. He confirmed that Leo and Mary Downard were each shot 3 times. Several bullet fragments were collected from Leo's skull and upper chest. Mary had also been shot in the head. The last shot surprised the medical examiner. The bullet had entered through the back of her head, just behind her left ear, at point-blank range. Sergeant Marshall questioned the Downard's children to see if they might know of someone who held a grudge against their parents. Their son said he couldn't think of anyone who would do this.
They're real good Mormons.
If there's
The two were beloved in the community and were devout churchgoers.
Was there any neighbors that they were having?
To Sergeant Marshall, they were brutal, senseless slayings. The ballistic evidence was sent to the Oregon State Police Forensic Lab in Ontario, Oregon. Lieutenant Rocky Mink examined the evidence.
In the Downard case, we were actually comparing fired bullets from the deceased to fired cartridge cases recovered at the scene.
He determined that the bullets and casings had come from a .22 caliber firearm. The shell casings were consistent with a .22 caliber rifle. He reported his findings to the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office. A rifle suggested that the killer may be a hunter who had the gun in his collection. It would have been hard to conceal. Police wondered if the perpetrator was concerned about hiding it at all. Idaho police struggled to find the gunman who shot down Leo and Mary Downard in their home. Shoe impressions left at the scene and .22 caliber bullets and casings were all that pointed to a killer. Investigators canvassed the Downard neighborhood looking for answers.
Hello, sir. Detective Rodriguez from the Bonneville County Sheriff's Office. Can I speak with you a moment? Come on, sit here.
One neighbor had seen a man at the house on the day of the murders. His name was Robert Buchanan, a local lawn care worker who had his own business. Buchanan did lawn work for many in the area, including the Downards. Sergeant Kim Marshall ran a background check on Buchanan to see if he had a record. The report indicated that Buchanan had threatened his ex-wife with a .22 caliber weapon, the same caliber firearm used in the Downard murders. He quickly became Sergeant Kim Marshall's prime suspect.
We looked at him as a suspect at the beginning of this homicide due to what we learned from our neighborhood interviews and doing some background checks. We found that there was some violence in his history.
Armed with a warrant, investigators searched Buchanan's apartment. They collected several articles of clothing, including a pair of white tennis shoes. But there were no guns of any kind. The shoes were sent to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab. There, senior criminalist Donna Shepherdson Mead compared the photographs of the shoe prints found in the bedroom to Buchanan's tennis shoes. But making an accurate comparison to the pictures was difficult.
The photograph was color. It was slightly out of focus. The camera was canted at a slight angle to the impression. And also, there was no scale included in this picture. Normally, we would use the scale to make a one-to-one enlargement.
Shepherdson Mead was able to determine that the print in the bedroom had the same brand design as Buchanan's tennis shoes, but Buchanan's shoes seemed to be too big. She hoped the cast taken outside the crime scene would make for a better comparison. A print was lifted from the shoe using dusting powder and transparent paper. Shepherdson Mead overlaid the print on the cast taken outside the residence. Again, the design matched, but the shoes seemed to be larger than the ones at the scene. It wasn't what investigators hoped, but they still believed Robert Buchanan was their killer. Police widened their search. Witness testimony had revealed that Buchanan's father had a gun collection. And Buchanan was a frequent visitor at the house.
You do have a 22 over here.
His father owned several rifles, including a .22.
Why don't you come on over and help the box?
Permission was granted to take the firearm. The gun was sent to Lieutenant Rocky Mink at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. To determine if the bullet casings recovered from the crime scene and the bullet fragments collected at autopsy had come from this rifle, Mink had to fire off a few rounds. He then collected the fired bullets and their casings. He examined the bullets through a comparison microscope.
The test fires from the known Remington rifle were examined and compared to the bullets removed from the deceased. Based on the microscopic detail that was present in the land and groove impressions, I was able to draw a conclusion that these bullets were fired from the suspect Remington rifle.
Investigators had proof that the .22 caliber rifle had fired the deadly shots. Robert Buchanan was charged with both murders. But a judge was not impressed with the police findings. The gun had not been found in Buchanan's possession, and the match of his sneakers to footprints found at the scene was inconclusive. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. Life in the town of Ammon went on uneasily, and the police could not let the crimes go unpunished. They had the murder weapon, but no evidence to tie anyone to the crime. 15 months later, Bonneville County authorities reopened the investigation.
Okay, Kim and Bud, why don't you go back to the house and start on the crime scene again.
Detective Victor Rodriguez was assigned to the case.
You'll see that there's statements from witnesses that put him in that area, and some of them said that this is the shoe prints that we saw.
Investigators pored over the evidence, looking for one small clue they must have overlooked. Rodriguez knew it wouldn't be easy.
It's one of the most difficult cases I handled because you had to start from the very beginning. You had to go back to the very beginning of this homicide and omit everything else that was learned and proceed with who could have been the suspect at that time.
Investigators re-interviewed the Downards' neighbors and friends. A neighbor did recall seeing a man drive by the house several times that day. It was Lanny Buchanan, Robert Buchanan's younger brother.
That's the last I saw him.
Lanny lived in the neighborhood, and he saw him often. Detective Rodriguez realized that Lanny had access to the .22 caliber rifle.
Okay, thank you.
The investigation took a major turn.
The more that I followed this case, the more that I investigated this case. When I focused on Lanny, halfway through the investigation, everything opened up like a puzzle, and Lanny put the pieces in that puzzle.
And the more they learned about him, the more suspicious they became. Many people described him as a slow learner with a violent temper. There was more. When word got out that Lanny was now a suspect in the murders, police received some unusual information.
All the women that we spoke to, all the friends that we talked to, all the men that we talked to, all said that Lanny would visit older ladies continually. Now, to me, that was a red flag.
One woman said that shortly before the murders, Lanny came over to her house upset and agitated. When she asked him what was wrong, he said that he had given Mary Downard a hug and that Mary had told him not to come over anymore. Lanny was very upset.
What are you doing? I think you better leave.
Detective Rodriguez brought Lanny in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murders and didn't recall the incident with Mary. The Downards were great people, and he frequently stopped by their house to say hello. When asked if he used his father's gun, he said he did, to go hunting on occasion. On the night of the murders, Lanny said he was at a friend's house watching a basketball game. He was released.
Did you tell me if did you kill the Downards?
Rodriguez contacted Lanny's friend to confirm his alibi. Lanny was there that night, but he left abruptly, saying he was going hunting. Police obtained a search warrant to search Lanny's house. In his bedroom closet, they discovered a pair of tennis shoes identical to his brother Robert's. They sent Lanny's shoes to forensic expert Donna Shepherdson Mead. She compared them with the cast taken outside the Downard residence. The tread, the general wear pattern at the ball of the foot, and the heel were consistent with Lanny's shoe. And these were one size smaller than the pair worn by Robert Buchanan, a direct match with the plaster cast taken at the crime scene.
I eliminated the larger pair of shoes, the size 9.5. I could not eliminate the size 8.5 pair of shoes.
The plaster shoe print placed Lanny Buchanan outside the Downard home. But he admitted he stopped by their house often. Investigators would need evidence that he was actually inside the house to make an arrest. Idaho police had a new suspect in the brutal murders of Leo and Mary Downard. Lanny Buchanan's shoes matched impressions found outside the residence. But they had to place him inside the house to be certain they had the right suspect. Investigators weren't going to take any chances with the photographs taken inside the house. They sent the crime scene photos to L. Eric Greenwade, a leading mathematician at the Idaho National Engineering Lab. First, Greenwade scanned the images into his computer. He corrected the pictures taken in the bedroom so he could accurately compare them to Lanny and Robert's shoes.
There were several problems with the photographs that were originally received. The first of which were the angle from which the photographs were taken, which was not directly above the footprint. Secondly, there was no objects directly related to measurement within the photographs, so that accurate measurements were difficult to take.
He needed to see the print head-on. Next, he used a special software program that created a mathematical reference and measured the grain in the wood floor.
The wood grain provided several points that we could measure very accurately. Those measurement points were then very carefully computed to form a background grid. Those background grids were then compared against the scanned photographs and provide the reference points for which the image could be corrected.
A computer then converted measurements into mathematical equations that corrected the problems created by the poorly taken photograph. Using the corrected images, Greenwade easily identified features such as nicks in the soles of the shoes. Lanny's shoes matched.
The measurements that were obtained from the image matched one of the pairs of shoes. This established a very strong connection to one set and yet not the other. In addition, there were several imperfections noted in the dust impression left on the floor that matched imperfections that were in the same pair of shoes.
Over a year and a half after the Downard murders, Lanny Buchanan was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Based on the evidence, police believe that Lanny Buchanan went to kill the Downards because Mary had rebuffed him. He forced his way in, carrying a .22 caliber rifle. Leo had nowhere to run. Mary was upstairs, stirred awake by the gunshots. But she never got the chance to get out of bed. In November 1996, Lanny Buchanan was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. When killers are desperate for revenge, it takes the hard work and determination of forensic professionals to provide the scientific facts that prove innocence or guilt, and ultimately provide justice to those who are victims of violent crime. In Tampa, Florida, women become a sadistic killer's prey, and cemeteries his personal dumping ground. As the body count rises, detectives confront a serial killer using science as their only weapon. In North Carolina, a young mother disappears on her way home from work. When her body is discovered, detectives must expose the hidden tracks of a killer if they are to find justice for her family. In most homicides, police rely on motive to pursue a murderer. But when the killer is a stranger, the crime may go unsolved for years. It takes a full arsenal of forensic techniques to trace a lethal encounter. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Tampa, Florida, October 10th, 1986. Detective Robert Parrish received a disturbing call. A jogger had discovered the nude body of a young black woman at Centro Español Cemetery. Crime scene investigators were dispatched to the scene. As they set up a perimeter, Detective Parrish questioned the jogger. Ron Denny said he ran through the cemetery daily. He rarely saw anyone. But this morning was different. The detective examined the body for injuries.
We had a nude black female in an open cemetery lot here. We found no signs of any cutting or stabbing, anything, no open wounds like that. She did have a fine mist of blood on her right side. It appeared to come out of her nasal area. This indicating that she had died either by blunt trauma or by asphyxiation.
Based on the condition of the body, it appeared the victim had been murdered less than 12 hours earlier.
Over here, so it looks like she was thrown out of the truck.
More than enough time for the killer to flee. Detective Parrish knew it would be a difficult case. They had to conduct a thorough search of the crime scene. As they photographed the victim, they noted she was barefoot. Oddly, the bottoms of her feet were clean. The ground was moist. She couldn't have walked to this location, and investigators saw no evidence she was dragged. The victim's personal effects were scattered all over the area. Each piece was numbered and cataloged as potential evidence.
We found her panties and top and her wig scattered throughout when we did a crime scene search.
The forensics team recovered a pair of women's shoes. There were also beer bottles and a cigarette pack. But there was no wallet or driver's license to identify the victim. Not far from the body, investigators found fresh tire tracks. Detective Parrish surmised the victim had been killed elsewhere and dumped in the cemetery.
The major item that we found was 9 feet from her head in the soft dirt there was a tire impression, obviously made by a big tire. Additionally, off 46th Street here, we had tire tracks coming in and what appeared tire tracks leaving.
A large vehicle, a truck or an SUV, made the tracks. Technicians made casts of the tread prints using plaster. Based on the condition of the body, investigators were confident a vehicle had been involved in the crime. The plaster would set in minutes, but it would take days to determine whether the tracks were significant. After processing the crime scene, officers canvassed the neighborhood, hoping that someone might have seen or heard something the night before.
When was the last time you talked to him?
I'm not sure.
Nobody had. At autopsy, the medical examiner noted pitula, a pinpoint hemorrhage in the victim's eyes. This, as well as linear abrasions on the collarbone and throat area, indicated that the victim had died from asphyxiation. Several bones in her neck were also broken. The medical examiner determined that a large individual had used his hands to manually strangle the victim. Ligature marks on her wrists revealed she had been bound before she was killed. Based on the degree of rigor mortis and the amount of insect activity, the medical examiner concluded that she'd been killed less than 12 hours earlier. Strands of the victim's hair were collected. In the event a suspect emerged, it was possible a strand of her hair was still in the suspect's vehicle. Identifying the victim was their next priority. Fingerprints were taken and run through the Tampa Police database. Within hours, Detective Parrish had a match. The victim was 34-year-old Tamara Jones.
After I found her identity, I located her mom and broke the news to her mom, and then got as much information, you get as much background information you can about her habits, who she was seeing, any steady boyfriends. About what you'd seen on that night.
From Tamara's mother, Detective Parrish learned a lot about the victim. She had been an outgoing girl, full of promise, until the lure of crack cocaine reduced her to a life of painful addiction. To pay for her habit, Tamara became a prostitute.
There was about 4 different bars in what we call the West Tampa area that she frequented. And in my job as an investigator, I had to go to the bars, find out who she knew, who she was seeing with, and just do some good legwork. You know, I found out that everybody spoke fairly highly of her. All the people I interviewed said that she was a very good girl, and she was a very good individual. Yeah, I talked to your mother
But
earlier.
Tamara's life on the streets put her in contact with a lot of unsavory characters. No one that the police talked to was able to pinpoint a suspect in Tamara's murder. Detective Parrish hit a dead end. He now looked for clues in other unsolved homicide cases. Not only from Tampa, but in Hillsborough County and surrounding cities. It took a week to review 2 years' worth of homicide files, looking for similarities. In the end, Detective Parrish was stunned by what he found.
Detectives had been working on several of the reports of previous homicides and similar type victims. We had other black females. They were known prostitutes. They were found in cemeteries. They were nude. They were all strangled. They had literature marks around their wrist, which means they had been either tied up or a restraining type device used on their wrist.
Detectives from the Tampa Police Department and Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office pooled their resources. Along with other agencies in the area, they formed a task force to find and stop a killer. But the lack of physical evidence found at each of the crime scenes and the lifestyle of the victims made them difficult cases to solve. Detective Parrish was certain they were dealing with a serial killer.
As soon as I get at the information, I'll start looking at
Somewhere in the Tampa area, he was waiting to strike again.
Get back with me with the information.
And police hadn't a single clue to his identity. Authorities in Tampa, Florida were certain they were dealing with a serial killer. 2 recent homicides bore striking similarities to a string of murders that went back over 2 years. Detective Robert Parrish knew they needed a suspect. But none of the investigators working the case had even a clue.
All the other detectives were obviously involved in the other cases who were at different stages, but you know, nobody really had anything concrete that we could say 100% sure. Several of the other detectives had different leads that they were investigating. And Garden of Memories.
News reports about the latest victim caught the attention of a potential witness. A man named Adam Childs contacted police. He told them that he knew Tamara Jones from the Tampa bar scene. He had seen her the night before her body was found in the cemetery. A dark truck approached Tamara on the street. She talked to the man inside. Childs had seen the vehicle in the neighborhood, but he didn't know to whom it belonged. For investigators, the dark truck rang a bell. They searched their files once again. 8 months earlier, a prostitute claimed that a customer in a dark truck had tried to kill her. The woman was afraid to press charges, but she agreed to speak with police about the incident.
Then, what happened inside the truck?
As she told investigators, a large black man she knew as Big Mike tried to pick her up that evening.
They were talking about, selling on a price for sex, and then he grabbed her around the throat and started to choke her. She reached for the doorknob, and then she got out, ran, and screaming through the neighborhood. The police were called, and he had fled the scene.
She gave investigators descriptions of Big Mike and the truck he was driving.
We can put him behind bars.
But she again refused to press charges or to testify against him.
Can you use both his hands or one hand?
Investigators checked their files. Big Mike was the nickname of a Tampa man named Michael Tyrone Crump. Police went to Crump's residence. The suspect was not at home, but a dark truck matching the witness's description was parked in the driveway. The officer photographed the vehicle. Detective Parrish then asked Adam Childs to come back to the station.
I did what's called a photo pack. I took, 6 different pictures of different trucks, including this individual we now become to label as a suspect. And the witness immediately picked out the truck.
Tampa police believed that Michael Tyrone Crump had committed at least 2 crimes, but they didn't have sufficient evidence to arrest him. Based on their 2 witnesses, they did have probable cause that these crimes were committed in his truck. And police have the authority to seize a vehicle if they believe it was used for illegal activities and may contain evidence of those crimes. Detective Parrish wanted to seize Crump's vehicle in a public place when it was on a public roadway.
We stopped the truck on the city streets and informed the driver, who turned out to be Michael Tyrone Crump, that we needed his truck for evidence. It was used in a recent crime. You can contact me at. When we finish processing your truck, I'll give you a call.
Crump remained calm, even when they asked if he knew Tamara Jones.
Good luck.
He said no. They informed him that he was not under arrest and that he was free to go. His truck was taken to the Pinellas County Sheriff's impound lot, where it was examined by trace evidence specialist Timothy Whitfield.
As a part of searching the vehicle, we were charged with finding any and all evidence that might be in there, from the things that are visible to the things that might be invisible to the naked eye.
Investigators first processed the vehicle for visible evidence. They found a woman's earring on the floor of the cab.
Go ahead and put that in a bag.
They also found a wooden device with a piece of rope attached called a garrote. Whitfield had no doubt as to its purpose.
It could be used to wrap the hands or feet of victims, and of course that's something that is unusual. Not everybody has that in their vehicle, and you would ask the question, well, why do you need this? What are you using it for if you're not using it as a restraint device?
Hidden between the rubber matting and the tire wall, investigators found another clue. It was a driver's license belonging to Janet King, one of the young women killed prior to Tamara Jones. Her body had also been found in a cemetery. Since King was a prostitute and Crump was a known John, the item in itself could be explained away. But to Whitfield, the location of the license was incriminating.
Either it was intentionally placed there by the suspect to hide it, or perhaps the victim put it there in hopes that in days to come someone would find something of her in that vehicle.
Now the team focused on evidence invisible to the human eye. They used a chemical called luminol to test for the presence of blood. A phosphorescent glow revealed a fine spray. The pattern was familiar. It matched the blood spatter from Tamara Jones's nose and face. Unfortunately, the droplets were tiny, no larger than pinpoints. There was no way to prove they belonged to the victim.
There was nothing that I was able to do because of the microscopic nature of the blood. That, of course, was prior to the days of DNA, and you needed quite a bit more blood to do complete workups.
Investigators vacuumed the interior of the truck, searching for any hair or fibers that could link the victims to the suspect. One intriguing find was a long knife hidden behind the front seat of the truck.
Got a pretty good sized machete, looks like. That's pretty good size, but good surface though.
I'll go ahead and secure this.
All right, careful.
In the laboratory, forensic examiners determined that the rope on the garrote was the same diameter as the ligature marks found on the wrists of the victims. Perhaps one of the most important pieces of evidence was a long strand of hair, one that couldn't have come from the suspect. Analysis of the root showed that it had not just fallen out. It had been ripped out of the scalp. The hair strand was compared to samples taken from Tamara Jones. The color and texture didn't match. When it was compared with Janet King's hair, however, it matched. Both were colored with identical hair dye. Technicians were confident that they had come from the same person. While the evidence from inside the truck was compelling, all it proved was that Janet King had been inside the vehicle. Now, detectives needed to tie Michael Tyrone Crump's vehicle to the murders. Time was running out. Without solid evidence, Crump would remain free, and more women could wind up dead. Authorities in Tampa, Florida were certain they were dealing with a serial killer. Two recent homicides bore striking similarities to a string of murders that went back more than 2 years. Detective Robert Parrish needed to connect Tamara Jones' murder to suspect Michael Crump's truck. Tire tracks left at the scene were his best hope. He sent the tire casts made at the crime scene, along with the vehicle's tires, to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. There, analyst Oral Woods studied the treads to see if Crump's truck had made the impressions found near Tamara Jones's body. Woods was surprised that Crump's truck had 3 different types of tires. The 2 front tires had similar treads. The rear tires had different tread designs. 2 of the tread designs on Crump's tires matched the tread designs in the casts made at the crime scene.
And I told Detective Parrish that we're definitely in the ballpark. We definitely could do something with them, that there was class characteristics present in the cast as well as some individual characteristics.
Class characteristics like tire size and tread design can indicate a specific manufacturer. By carefully comparing photographs, Woods determined that the tire tracks at the crime scene had identical class characteristics to Crump's rear tires. He then analyzed the casts and the tires for individual characteristics. Things like nicks, tread wear, or embedded pieces of gravel that can make a tire track as unique as a fingerprint. On the right rear tire, he found what he was looking for.
I found one area on the tire that has some cuts and nicks, which I was also able to find on the plaster cast that was poured at the crime scene. I went one step further. I made a plaster cast of that area and recorded the same individual characteristics.
Woods confirmed that the tire track found at the crime scene was made by the suspect's right rear tire. On February 7th, Michael Crump went to the Tampa Police Department to ask about getting his truck back. But first, Detective Parrish had some important questions for him. Like how a woman he'd been seen with on October 9th was found dead the next day, and why his tire tracks were found several feet from her body. Crump again denied knowing Tamara Jones. He claimed that he'd been working in the area and cut through the cemetery the night before the murder.
Let me show you something, what was found in your truck. You see that? That's her license. And that was found
But when the detective brought out one more piece of evidence, Janet King's driver's license, Crump was surprised and sensed that he had been caught.
He's a big guy, and he slumped his shoulders down and looked down, which indicated to me that I had, with the license, showing him the license, that I had struck a nerve.
Crump admitted to picking up Tamara Jones on the night in question. He claimed they fought and that Tamara had tried to stab him. He admitted to strangling her, but swore it was in self-defense. To the detective, Crump's version of her death could not explain the restraint device and ligature marks left on the victim. The evidence pointed to a well-planned MO that Crump had used before. Detectives next questioned Crump about the murder of Janet King. He admitted to once having picked her up, but claimed she left him within minutes. He said he knew nothing about the other 7 victims. They didn't buy his explanations.
All indications are that because of the other black females turned up a similar type of death, that he was involved in those. We were able to tie him 100% to 2 of the homicides that were similar, but not enough evidence to tie him to the others.
In separate trials, Crump was found guilty of the murders of both Tamara Jones and Janet King. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The other murder cases remain officially unsolved. Michael Tyrone Crump attacked women he randomly selected from the streets. But in North Carolina, an innocent encounter with a stranger ends in violence and death. On August 8, 1990, a Raleigh, North Carolina police officer responded to a report about a suspicious minivan parked on a side street. The officer called in the tag numbers.
Tags Mary Young John 1971.
The vehicle was registered to 24-year-old Katie Valoria, an employee at a nearby hospital. The previous evening, Katie's husband had reported her missing. The officer made a gruesome discovery. Inside the van was the new dead body of a young woman. As police cordoned off the area, crime scene investigators arrived on the scene. Detective John Beasley examined the van.
Indications were looking through the windows. There was a struggle inside the van based on the fact that her shoes were located in the front part of the van. Her body is in the back of the van. Pantyhose were around her neck. They had been pulled tight. They weren't knotted or anything, but they were still tight around her neck. It was obvious she had been strangled.
The victim's clothing and purse were missing. There was also evidence suggesting sexual assault. Investigators scoured the exterior of the van for clues. A canine team was called in to assist. The handler gave the dog the scent and commanded him to track. The dog led the handler down the street and away from the van. Crime scene investigator W.E. Hensley was part of the search team.
Basically, it told us that whoever parked that van there, and this early in the morning, got out of the van on the driver's side, went up to the street to the employee parking gate of the hospital, went by that gate and went to an area where there was a parking space. And that was significant.
It appeared the attack had started here. Police searched the area, but found no additional clues. The van was taken to the Raleigh Police impound lot, where the body was removed for autopsy.
I felt that in moving the van, we would remove the entire crime scene with the body in it and move it to a location where it could be processed properly.
Hensley didn't want to lose any critical hair or fiber evidence by opening the van under less than ideal conditions.
Every crime scene tells a story. The time of day, the ambient conditions, who was the victim, what kind of signature might have been left by the suspect. As far as processing the vehicle, we felt that trace evidence, which is hairs, fibers, things of that nature, were going to be very important to the case. Of course, you never rule out the possibility of fingerprints or any other kind of impressions that you might get.
They dusted for prints, but only found a few useless smudges. The killer, it appeared, had tried to wipe his prints before abandoning the vehicle.
Whoever went into that vehicle left some of their self there and then took some of that vehicle with them. And so we were looking for any traces of those two criteria.
In the front seat, they found a pair of women's shoes. They were scraped on both the heel and toe. A set of jumper cables was also found in the front seat.
The jumper cables indicated that possibly the victim was in the process of helping someone with a vehicle problem, probably in the parking lot.
On the driver's floor mat, investigators spotted muddy footprints.
There was an impression on these mats. It appeared to be that of a tennis shoe. We felt possibly that may be of value to us.
But the mats had to be handled with extreme care.
What we had to be concerned with is that the mats are flexible. In flexing the mats or moving them about much, you were going to actually distort the impression left in mud. So we had to keep them perfectly flat, place them in boxes and tape them over so that we could transport these without disturbing the impressions.
Technicians searched for trace evidence. Any hair or fiber adhering to the tape lift would be preserved and examined. They found some hairs embedded in the ceiling of the van. They were inconsistent with the victim's hair, which meant they could belong to her killer. Detectives theorized that the killer had climbed on top of the victim and rubbed his head against the ceiling of the van. Investigator Hensley began to piece together a profile of the killer.
From all indications, he was in the employee parking lot and therefore may be associated with the victim to some extent in that they worked at the same place.
At autopsy, the medical examiner observed contusions on the victim's neck and determined she had been strangled to death. Strands of hair were removed and placed in an envelope. The hairs went to the crime lab, where analysts could compare them to other strands found during the investigation. There was also evidence of sexual assault. The examiner collected samples of biological fluids found on the victim. A brutal rapist and violent killer was loose on the streets of Raleigh, North Carolina. Detectives had to find him before he could strike again. In North Carolina, police investigated the violent rape and murder of a 24-year-old wife and mother. With little information and no witnesses, detectives went to the hospital where Katie Valoria worked. According to her colleagues, Katie was well liked and had no enemies. On the night of her death, she left work just before 6 p.m. The co-worker described Katie as a devoted wife and mother. She got along well with everyone in the workplace. Katie's colleagues said she couldn't imagine Katie having a single enemy in the world. A colleague who left moments later didn't see her or any strange individuals in the parking lot. Without any witnesses, investigators would have to try a new approach. Since Katie's purse was not in her car, the killer might have stolen her credit cards. Detective Beasley contacted her bank and learned that on the night of the murder, someone used her cash card 3 times at the same ATM.
You got $100 out the first time you used it, and that was all you could draw at that time from a cash point. So on one day is $100. He went back, tried to use it again, and then tried to use it a third time.
Detectives retrieved the ATM security camera photos, but they were too blurry to identify the man using the machine. Between the first and second transaction, another customer used the machine. The man told police that he remembered the encounter vividly. A young black man had just made a withdrawal when he arrived, but he didn't seem to be finished with his business.
He was standing next to him when he got the $100 out. Then he saw the guy try to use the card again. He said he was acting suspicious because he was wondering why it was taking him so long. He'd already seen him take the money out, so he knew he couldn't do it but one time, and here he is up there trying to use it again.
The witness gave a police sketch artist information regarding the suspect's height, weight, coloring, and facial features. Now armed with a detailed description, investigators went to the hospital. Someone recognized the face. It looked like a man who worked in the hospital laundry. The laundry room supervisor confirmed that the picture resembled 23-year-old Michael Sexton. His timesheet showed that he'd been on the job the day of Katie's murder, but disappeared that afternoon. She said he returned around 6:30.
He'd been missing for like 2 hours, and all of a sudden he comes running into the hospital, says he's got to go home, he's been having car trouble, and books. And he doesn't show up for work on Thursday and Friday.
To the detectives, Michael Sexton was acting like a man with something to hide. But they were still a long way from linking him to Katie's rape and murder. Detectives went to the home that Sexton shared with his girlfriend. who allowed them to search the residence. They collected some of his uniforms and pairs of tennis shoes, according to W.E. Hensley.
We collected 3 pairs of tennis shoes, and we took those all into our possession, and of course they were marked as potential evidence items, and we took those back to our lab to analyze for any possible matches.
The suspect's shoes and the muddy floor mats were sent to the Wake County Identification Bureau. There, Johnny Leonard specializes in footprint analysis.
There's one thing about criminals. They may put on gloves, they can put stockings over their faces, but hardly anybody thinks about their feet, because that's what you run with, that's what you walk on. So I always believe that footprints is the most overlooked evidence at crime scenes.
Leonard studied the muddy footprints, looking first for class characteristics like tread pattern. He then looked for individual characteristics like cuts or gouges. Next, he studied the 3 pairs of sneakers taken from the suspect's home.
Looking at the footprints, I could easily say that 2 of the sets of shoes did not make those tracks, because you can obviously look at them and see that the class characteristics were not the same.
But the 3rd pair was a similar size and make as the print from the crime scene. Leonard dusted the bottom of the shoe with magnetic powder. Then, with a wide piece of tape, he lifted the sole design and adhered it to a backing card. The card was placed in a large camera where it would be photographed and transferred to a transparency. Once it was developed, they could lay the transparency over the photograph of the mat for a comparison. But that would take time. They still needed to locate Sexton, who hadn't been seen in days. Detectives in North Carolina worked around the clock investigating the brutal murder of 24-year-old wife and mother, Katie Villoria. A man named Michael Sexton had been identified as a suspect, but had yet to be located. At the crime lab, latent print examiner Johnny Leonard had lifted latent shoe prints from the evidence taken from the crime scene. He placed a transparency of the suspect's sneaker print over a transfer of the floor mat from the victim's car. Leonard compared individual characteristics and finally found what he was looking for.
There was a little cut at the arch of one of the treadwear designs that was present also on the known shoes. So without a doubt, we knew that it was the same, made from the same shoe.
Investigators had evidence that tied the perpetrator to the vehicle, but still had nothing putting him in contact with the victim. While latent shoe prints are usually obtained from flat objects at a crime scene, even irregular surfaces can yield the occasional clue. Leonard applied magnetic powder to the upper sole and heel of the victim's shoe.
And lo and behold, a very small portion of a shoe track appeared.
He set the partial shoe print on a backing card and compared it to the full-size print of the suspect's sneaker. The partial print from Katie Villoria's shoe matched a portion of the suspect's shoe print.
Without a doubt, the suspect had been in contact with the victim personally.
Police went to the home that Sexton shared with his girlfriend, according to Detective Beasley.
The detectives located Michael Sexton at that point.
We told him that we were talking to people at the hospital, and it was his turn. Would he come down and talk with us about it, which he agreed to do.
At the police department, Sexton was cooperative. He agreed to give biological samples for testing. Sexton swabbed the inside of his mouth to give a DNA sample. And he willingly allowed for hairs to be taken. These two would be compared in the lab.
Okay, that completes the gathering of the hairs.
Criminalist Hensley recognized the importance of the evidence.
What we were dealing with and what we felt we were dealing with as far as evidence potential in this particular vehicle was blood, body fluids, hairs, fibers, clothing, and those are the things that we concentrated on.
Using a comparison microscope, examiners looked for similarities between two hair samples. Color, length, and diameter are among the major features analyzed. The known sample taken from the victim at autopsy and the unknown sample from the victim's van were compared side by side. The analysis confirmed the victim was not the source of the hair found in the van. But when the hair from the victim's van was compared to the sample taken from the suspect, it was practically a perfect match. That wasn't the only evidence placing Michael Sexton in the back of Katie Villoria's van. To fully process the clothing taken from Sexton's house, technicians laid the clothing out across a wide table. Using clear adhesive tape, they combed every inch of fabric for hair and fibers. Fibers from the victim's van were found on the suspect's clothing, and fibers from the clothing were found in the van. Investigators still needed to determine if the suspect's DNA matched the biological fluids found on the victim.
Certainly the body fluids that we found on the victim's body had the potential for DNA analysis. And they are more or less a positive form of identification. Other than fingerprints, if you can't find fingerprints, that certainly is one of the better forms of identification.
To analyze the suspect's DNA samples, scientists used a process called electrophoresis to separate specific enzymes out of each sample. Certain enzymes vary from person to person. Electrophoresis utilizes an electric current to separate the enzymes for analysis. The sample is placed in a gel and a current is applied, causing the enzymes to move through the gel. Each enzyme moves a certain distinct distance, creating a pattern of bands. If two blood samples create the same pattern, it's probable they came from the same source. In this case, they matched. At the police station, detectives confronted Sexton with the evidence. He denied everything.
As the interview went on, he kept digging a little bit deeper hole for himself and denying that he even knew her. And I think then he started looking for kind of an out, something that would make him look in the best light.
Sexton told police that he was having car trouble. He said that the victim offered to drive him to his cousin's to get some jumper cables.
And he said when he got around there that she consented to have sex with him, and then when they got in the back of the van, she changed her mind, and he knew she had seen his name tag and all that and was going to report him.
Detectives knew there was more to the story. They believed that Sexton used his car trouble as bait. Fueled by a criminal appetite, he took advantage of Katie's kindness and overpowered her. The people of the state of North Carolina convicted Michael Sexton of first-degree murder and rape. He received the death sentence and was executed in November 2001. When a killer and a victim share no personal history, detectives can find themselves working in the dark. But for investigators committed to finding justice, no piece of evidence is too small. Today, forensic science can uncover a murder and bring to light evidence of a lethal encounter.